everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and on this episode, we're speaking with Zoe Weinberg, founder and managing partner at ante, the first venture fund dedicated to agentic tech. We start out our conversation by getting a little insight into Zoe's background, which is quite unique and unusual, but also lends itself quite well to the work she's doing today in privacy and human agency. She shares the ways in which her past humanitarian work in conflict zones and developing nations have opened her eyes to issues around surveillance capitalism and how she had her first big realization of how crypto can change individuals' lives in meaningful ways when she met a group of Bitcoin miners in Iraq during the Mosul conflict when Iraq successfully took back the city of Mosul from the Islamic State. We then dive into some big topics around agentic tech, including user control, consent, privacy, and online and on-chain data sharing. Zoe envisions a world where humans have full agency over how their information and data are used, and we talk about what it might take for us to get there. I loved recording this episode because it touches on so many big, real-world issues that impact everyone, and that everyone, not just those deeply entrenched in crypto and Web3, can understand and relate to. I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it, and please share this with a friend who you think might also enjoy it, and collect it at pods.media/rehash to support Rehash and the wonderful guests who come on the podcast. If you'd like to further discuss some of these topics with myself or with other listeners, please join our community on Telegram at t.me/rehashweb3. Zoe was nominated by Anastasia Uglova, who was a previous guest on Rehash back in Season 2, Episode 15, and voted onto the podcast by Anastasia, Aaron Soskin, and myself, Diana Chen. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Zoe. Zoe, I'm so happy to have you on Rehash. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Diana.
Of course, and shout out Anastasia for the amazing nomination. We were talking earlier about this. She always brings us the very best people, so I'm so excited to chat with you. I typically don't start with a whole, tell me your background or whatever, but I do think that you have a really fascinating background, and so I'd love to know, if you could give us a little insight into some of the humanitarian work that you've done in the past and nonprofit work that have kind of contributed to your interest and your passion in privacy and human agency today.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a very, unusual background for most people who are in venture. I've spent a lot of my career in investing, but a lot of it was focused on emerging markets investing and also on fragile and conflict-affected states. Pretty early in my career, I worked at the World Bank at something called the International Finance Corporation, which is really like the private sector investment arm of the World Bank. I had previously worked at Goldman, like that, finance was my background. But when I was at the World Bank, I ended up doing a lot of deals and work in conflict zones. So I ended up spending time in places like Somalia and South Sudan and DRC, Liberia during the Ebola crisis, and so forth. And then later, I actually worked as an emergency response worker in Iraq in the summer of 2017. So I ended up spending a lot of time, surprisingly, in conflict zones. Usually, we had our sort of investor hat on as part of the World Bank, but on the side, I became really interested in the ways in which technology was being used in a lot of those settings and environments, both, to kind of surveil and manipulate and control people, but also the ways that people were finding tech as a means of empowerment, whether that was recording, things that they were seeing in their day-to-day life or, messaging each other, secure communications channels like Signal and stuff like that. Or, in the case of Iraq, we're mining Bitcoin because the local currency wasn't reliable. And I just became really fascinated by that kind of interesting and complex dynamic. And that really kind of planted a seed in the back of my head that ended up in many ways, I think, leading, kind of laying the groundwork for the work that I'm doing now. But it definitely, is a little bit strange and unusual. Being an aid worker is a very different lifestyle and type of work than working in venture. I will say one thing that has really stuck with me is a real sense of perspective, right? Like you really feel the stakes of your work when you are working on the front lines of an active conflict zone. And so then when something is going wrong, when you are working at a company or whatever, I think it's helpful to kind of keep in mind, the scale and the stakes. And so I found that to be a really helpful kind of lingering lesson from all of that. I also spent some time working in politics. I worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016 and for a short time kind of caught the political bug. So yeah, I've had a sort of circuitous path to what I'm doing now, but I've very much felt like all of those experiences were very formative in allowing me to kind of identify the market opportunities and thesis that I'm really focused on now.
So was the first time that you were exposed to crypto when you saw the Bitcoin miners in Iraq and you were kind of like, what are you guys doing? Like, what is this all about?
Kind of. I lived in Nairobi from 2015 to 2016. And I remember that, I had some friends and friends of friends in Nairobi who were really like my first introduction to Bitcoin and were mining Bitcoin there. But I think it remained a little bit far removed for me, or it felt very far removed. And then the summer of 2017 was when I was living and working in Iraq. It was during the period in which Iraqi forces and the US coalition were retaking the city of Mosul from ISIS. So it was a very kind of intense time in the conflict. I was there when Mosul was retaken. So that was a really joyous moment in the country. But yes, I got to know, and I've talked about this before, but I got to know a group of guys who I believe to be the first, Bitcoin miners in the country. I mean, I guess maybe we don't totally empirically know that, but yeah, I think for me, I was a little bit like, okay, guys, like, what are we doing here? And they super smart, really resourceful. And also, frankly, oil rich country, subsidized electricity, like you can kind of make the math work, And it was folks who otherwise were reliant on the Iraqi dinar, which is a historically pretty unreliable currency. Iraq is also sanctioned, every which way. And so it's very, very hard to participate in the global banking system. And almost everybody who was involved in that operation at one point or another had either been a refugee or had been displaced. And so knew the risks of having to, maintain control over your assets in a country that can be in free fall. And so I think for a lot of them, it really was a little bit existential. It was like, okay, ISIS could take over the country tomorrow, but, if I am holding Bitcoin and ETH, like I can leave and have assets. And that was a real form of financial security and freedom. And I think that's for me when it really kind of clicked that, it wasn't just a bunch of bros in San Francisco or making bank. It was like, there was something really powerful and meaningful there.
I love that story, and I've heard you tell it before, but I just wanted you to tell it again. Even today, so many times, people who aren't in crypto will see people in crypto and they'll be like, work on some real world problems, like there are people suffering in the world, like there are global conflicts happening, and here you are playing with your little crypto thing. And I think people just don't realize the bigger implications that crypto can have on people's lives and really change the whole, it was life or death for them, at least they probably felt that way. Like if they stayed in Iraq and ISIS took over, that's the end of that. Or they could mine Bitcoin, they could try to get some other sort of financial stability outside of their global currency and maybe have a way out of the country if everything went to hell.
I think I think you're completely right, Diana. I think it's really easy to take traditional finance systems and TradFi generally for granted and to think it's pretty good when you live in like a relatively mature, stable democracy where you generally are assured access to your accounts when you need them and you have a relatively stable currency. Like I think there's so much to be taken for granted when you're like sitting in the US, for example. And that's just not the case for many, many people around the world. And so I think, I very much think about it from the perspective of financial freedom and open banking. And yeah, I think often come back to these very kind of real world stories that at the time I don't even fully, it took me a while, I think, to really wrap my mind around what was so potent and meaningful there. But yeah, I just think it's easy to be like, dismissive when you have an alternative that most of the time works pretty well for you, you know?
Yeah, no, 100%. And even like the first time I heard you tell that story, I don't even remember where, I was thinking like how degen can you be in the midst of a global conflict to be, playing around with crypto? And then once I got past that initial reaction, which was wrong, and understood why they were doing what they were doing, I was like, holy shit, like the impact here is so big. So going back to some of the humanitarian work you did in the past and, recognizing some issues around surveillance capitalism or authoritarianism in these countries that you lived in, can you describe some of the things that you saw around that and how you've seen that evolve as well over time with the development of technology? I mean, I think, surveillance capitalism isn't anything new. Like anybody that read 1984, knows that like it's been around pre-tech even, but with technology, it's definitely opened up additional channels for people to take advantage of that. So can you describe like what you saw when you worked in those countries, like in, the early 2010s or mid 2010s until today, 10 years later, as tech has developed so much, how you've seen that evolve?
I think there's kind of digital authoritarianism broadly, which most people think about as being like state-sponsored actions. I would argue there's also kind of a form of like corporate digital authoritarianism, which we can talk about. But that latter piece is often very, I would say, synonymous or overlapping with like the concept of surveillance capitalism, which Shoshana Zuboff, wrote a book about and really kind of coined the term that everybody should go read. But yeah, I think you're right. Okay, 1984, like surveillance for sure has been a key feature of state and sometimes corporate operations for a very, very long time. I think what makes this a little bit different is that in the last decade or so, so much of our lives have migrated online and have become digital in different ways. And suddenly each of us has this massive data footprint and data exhaust from our day-to-day interactions and lives that actually paint a quite complex picture and a quite detailed picture of an individual that like simply wasn't possible to collect, 10 years ago, or wouldn't have been able, or it would be difficult to collect that sort of profile without a lot of concerted energy and action. Now, any company that is just scooping up massive amounts of user data can do that in a quite passively. And, a lot of that data can be used in ways that are really helpful for the consumer, more personalized recommendations and offerings. And, there's lots of people who say, I love targeted advertising. They always know what fall sweater I want to buy, right? But I think what's tricky is that we live in a world where we have very few opportunities to opt out, right? So there's very little choice there. And unless you really kind of want to live a pretty analog life, which is like increasingly hard to do if you are, working in a digitally connected world and, have a livelihood that requires you to be connected. So I think it's a little bit unrealistic to say, oh, well, you can just opt out of Google. Like that's hard, right? And so I think that's part of what makes, 2024 quite different from 2000, right? It's just the sheer kind of volume of data and volume of interactions. And as a result, what that has meant, to kind of move back to digital authoritarianism is that powerful actors, whether it's a state government or a non-state actor or a corporation, can potentially like use facial recognition to target you in ways that you might not have ever predicted. We've seen that, in policing in the United States. We've also seen it, used by Beijing to target the Uyghur population. So there's a whole host of ways that people are kind of leveraging these new tools and new forms of technology to really oppress their citizens. Another great example is around censorship and access to information. There, at this point, I wish I knew the number off the top of my head, over 100 countries that have actively engaged in state-sponsored internet blackouts in order to prevent citizens from being able to access information about potentially like political mobilization efforts and organizing and things like that. It's a real stronghold on the free flow of information that is quite troubling. Now, yes, has there always been propaganda? Yes, there has. Has there always been states trying to control the flow of information? Yes, there has. But the level of effectiveness in which those strategies can now be deployed is quite scary. And so that is really, I think, like the big shifts that we're seeing. It manifests a little bit differently in different states and different environments. And I think, we were talking before about taking for granted living in certain places. I think in the US, we sometimes sort of take for granted our access to information, censorship, all those things. But we're seeing like inklings of those dynamic here too. And so I think we just have to be really vigilant about what that means, how we sort of protect ourselves as individuals and protect ourselves as, as a broader democracy and society that would like to be free and open.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing is that as corporations, like you said, you can kind of see it as there's state-sponsored surveillance capitalism, and then there's like corporate action. And I think the corporate side of things was not really that much of a concern until technology developed more and more. Whereas, the state-sponsored actions, like that's always kind of been around. Have you seen that state-sponsored actions and corporate actions have merged together, that they're working together to accomplish certain goals? How do you see us combating this in order for it to not get worse and spiral out of control?
I think the corporate side was really originally driven in large part by ad-based revenue models, right? That an ad-based revenue model requires that you, in order to have sort of effective advertising, requires you to know a lot about users. And so suddenly data on users became extremely valuable. And so the incentives to, and hoover up kind of more and more information about customers generally, all of a sudden, those incentives were there. I think the worry is that, I think there's lots of dimensions to this worry, but one challenge is when it comes to kind of these entities working together is that there are plenty of ways that a state or government entities can purchase certain types of data from commercial enterprises and actors, right? I mean, a lot of, technology around law enforcement and policing and things like that can fall in that realm. I'm not trying to imply that, state governments are necessarily doing something that is illegal per se, but I think there are kind of these concerning ways in which you sort of think your data might be used for one set of actions or one set of use cases, and in fact there probably are a whole other set that we're not highly aware of. And a big piece of this, which actually Anastasia has done a lot of writing on and thinking on, is about consent, right? I think there's a difference between being a privacy absolutist and saying everything should be private, which I would say I'm not a privacy absolutist. There's lots of reasons to share your data for different reasons. But the ability to really have consent over that, I think, has eroded over time. And yes, we click through a lot of terms of service and consent screens. Whether or not that is like meaningful user consent, I think it's like really, really tough.
Do you see that changing in the future? Like, do you think, the reason we have all of these like 20-page long terms and conditions that nobody reads through and clicks accept to, like, do you think that is just function of, lawyers not really knowing what to do with all of this digital advertising and stuff whenever that came out, and thinking like, okay, well, this is we're just going to put everything in here, and this is like the best way to protect, to make whatever we deem to be legal. But now that we've seen some of the negative effects of what can happen when all of our data is online, especially without our consent, do you see that changing in the future? GDPR laws or just laws around your online privacy and consent and things like that will eventually make some of the actions that corporations or even states are taking today with collecting our data online maybe illegal in the future.
Yeah. So I think there's three things that are potentially driving some change there around, clicking through giant terms of service. One, and you're right, like I think lawyers and law firms have generally had the incentive to be as protective of their clients as possible. And so in many ways, that means being fairly permissive in what a company can do with user data, even if that's not what they're intending to do on day one. And so I think a few things are driving change. One is that there has been some litigation and case law around, giving people so many, terms that they're signing up for that they're, not able to meaningfully comprehend. And so there is a little bit of an onus on a company to make those terms scrutable and, easily consumable for folks. Debate on whether or not we always see a lot of that, but that's, I think there is some movement there, and there's been some action from courts in that direction. The second is that I do think that there are companies that are, companies have realized that a really important part of their relationship with their customers is trust. And so, if they violate that trust repeatedly and in ways that the user really didn't foresee, you're really potentially undermining your relationship with those users. Now, again, it depends a little bit what the service or product is. I think, I have seen companies, sort of proactively go above and beyond to explain to users, like, here's how your data is going to be used. Like, we will never sell your data, or here's how we will use it, et cetera, in large part to build that trust. And then the third is as you sort of mentioned, regulatory action. And I do think, we're sort of seeing a somewhat, evolving regulatory landscape. There hasn't been federal privacy legislation. There probably should be. And so we're seeing work of regulatory frameworks emerge at the state level. Makes it quite complicated, I think, to navigate for many companies. But what does end up happening is something like the CCPA in California, becomes the standard that then, everyone kind of has to adhere to if you want to operate in California. And so I think the changing regulatory aspect too is causing some movement there. So that's a very, sort of interesting and live area. I will say, people sometimes ask, is the changing regulatory landscape going to make it much harder for smaller players? And I would say potentially yes, potentially no, right? Oftentimes compliance, like big regulatory and compliance costs, can be a big moat for larger companies and players. But the flip side is that newer, smaller, more, kind of more nimble startups can be quite quick to adapt and don't have the kind of technical overhang and debt that a larger company has. So it potentially can be quite advantageous for new entrants, which is pretty interesting from an innovation standpoint.
Compared to most of my friends in Web3, I'm not the most online person. And with how fast things move in this space, it can be really challenging to keep up with the newest projects and what's trending. That's why I love Forage, a community-curated front page for launches shaping on-chain culture. A Forage launch page combines a press release and a commemorative mint into a sleek single page where they garner support in the form of mint. Projects receiving more mints are bumped to the top of the page, which means I can finally stop doom scrolling or worrying about missing an important launch and simply check Forage to stay up to date on what's happening on-chain. And as an added bonus, Forage uses protocol rewards, so supporters receive a referral reward each time someone mints through their referral link. Go to forage.xyz to get started today. Absolutely. So I want to talk about Ante, which is your venture fund, and it's the first venture fund dedicated to agentic technology. Agentic tech is, I think, not a term that most people are probably familiar with. Anastasia actually alluded to this. I don't know if she used the exact words agentic tech, but she essentially described this concept back when she was on Rehash all the way back in season 2. So it's something that I know you've been working on. People like, Anastasia have been working on as well. Can you, for people who aren't familiar with this concept, first just start by telling us what do you mean by agentic tech? How do you define this concept?
I learned the term agentic tech originally from Anastasia, and it emerged in privacy tech circles, quite a few years ago, to really refer to any technology that enhances human agency. So it's agentic, it's agency producing, and gives individuals more control over things like privacy, data, assets, the information you consume, algorithms, etc. So really about sort of like digital agency and digital control is what is agentic and so forth. So really the focus is on having agency over your digital life. And that can play out in a whole bunch of ways, which we can talk about. But, it's been interesting because recently, people have been using the term agentic or agentic tech to more narrowly refer to AI agents, that an agent is agentic. I think from our perspective, I'd love to hear what Anastasia thinks. An AI agent can, in fact, be agentic in the way we mean if it truly is acting on a user's behalf with the user's permission, their consent, their credentials, their preferences embedded. Then yeah, I would argue that an AI agent is an extension of human agency and is agentic in the way we mean. If an AI agent is really kind of operating as an AI overlord or as a bot or something like that, then I would probably argue that it's less agentic, right? That's what we mean when we refer to agentic tech. And we have made some investments in companies that are working on AI agents or AI agent infrastructure and so forth. But we see it as a much broader space of technology that is ultimately empowering of human agency. When you think about things like privacy, ownership, etc., you can probably guess that like a lot of the technology that we see as agentic are things that are more private, more secure, more decentralized. But within that, we cast a very broad net. We look at things in cybersecurity, crypto Web3, data infrastructure, AI, things like digital identity often come up a lot. But we're a little bit of an unusual fund in that we're very thematically focused and very thesis driven, but we're quite agnostic as to what industry vertical that plays out in or what type of technology is used to, sort of advance those objectives. So that makes us a little bit, a little unusual. And as far as we know, there's been no other venture fund that's exclusively focused on this area. That being said, there are a lot of funds where, either individual partners of the funds have been very interested in these areas for a long time, or they're focused on a piece of this. Like maybe they're they're a crypto focused fund that I would say shares a lot of our interests and values. So we're part of a much, I think, longer lineage and richer, kind of rich history of investors who've been thinking along these lines but may not have, sort of branded their funds that way.
I think one of the coolest things about you guys is that you are tech stack agnostic. Like you'll invest in AI, you'll invest in Web3 crypto, you'll invest in whatever it takes to get us to this end state, this end goal that we all have. I think that concept of an AI agent in this context is really interesting as well. And that's not something that I've thought of, but it's almost like if we could design an AI agent that is essentially our proxy. Like I have a robot proxy that's my AI agent, and this AI agent is going to really act on my behalf, and it's going to be a lot smarter than I am. It's going to have access to a lot more resources and data and be able to control the various things that I can't even manage myself. I think that is a really cool idea. I don't know how feasible that is, or if it is feasible, how far off we would be, but that almost seems like it would be combining a lot of individual ideas or individual projects that are tackling this topic all into one AI agent that, each individual person could have to act in their best interest.
And on the point of privacy, it is really hard for an individual to constantly try to monitor, what settings are on what apps and what consent screens they're signing off on, etc. One thing that excites me is like if you had an AI agent that understood your preferences on kind of a deep level, like here's what I'm comfortable with, here's what I'm not comfortable with, here's what I want out in the world, here's what I don't, etc. And then it could just execute that on your behalf. That could be quite great. That could be a way of like threading this needle between part of what is really hard and exhausting about our digital lives is feeling often like it's a little bit out of your control, right? Where you're like, I think I know what my privacy settings are on all these, different websites and communities, etc. But having to be responsible for that, especially as our profiles proliferate over time, is really hard. And actually, I'll give a shout out. There's a company called Privacy Party, it used to be called Block Party, that helps users to actually execute a lot of this on their behalf. And when it's quite fascinating when you actually run it, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize those random Facebook albums were public from 15 years ago, so would definitely recommend people check out Privacy Party.
I used Block Party back in the day, and I thought they shut down. I didn't realize they pivoted to Privacy Party, so I have to check that out. I used Block Party.
Now, yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was Block Party. They used to do where they would, I guess, like hide comments on Twitter or like auto block people that they thought you wouldn't want to see comments from and stuff like that, right?
Same one. And their mandate has expanded over time. And actually, I would totally recommend having Tracy, the founder, on the show sometime.
You should nominate her next season. Now that you're a guest, you'll be able to nominate and vote in future seasons. So definitely nominate her. I would love to have her on. So when we think about, the impact that agentic tech can have in our lives, I think, a couple things that come to mind first. The first thing is sort of like the impact that agentic tech can have on our daily lives as users of the internet. And so, things like what ads do we see, like what data is being collected when we go on TikTok and, use that. Or I personally made the grave mistake of buying something off Temu like a long time ago before everybody knew what it was. I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's like, like such like cheap stuff. It's like another Alibaba or something. And of course now like my phone number is everywhere in China and I get all these like random texts in Chinese. I mean, I get spammed all the time and I know I did that to myself, but like people don't know, like it's almost like if you really care that much about your privacy, the only way to really protect it is to just not use the internet. So that's one aspect that comes to mind immediately. And then another aspect is like going back to what you were talking about with your background in humanitarian aid is the impact that agentic tech can have on people living in like oppressive regimes or war zones or things like that around the world. Is there anything else that you think is like important to call out when we think about the impact that agentic tech can have on the world?
Ultimately, we see agentic tech as being really critical to building a future democracy that is more robust and resilient. Like, we really see this as being a counterweight to the authoritarian surveillance state model of technology that has been evolving around the world. There's obviously some key players there that everybody knows, but like when you think about, okay, like how would you construct an authoritarian surveillance state? We have a lot of answers. How do you construct the opposite? That ultimately prioritizes like, user control or distributed systems or whatever. We haven't quite answered that question. And that I think is fundamentally what we're trying to tackle with this fund. What are the technology structures, systems, architectures, models that ultimately help to, empower a society that is like free and open and democratic? And I think our hunch there is like, it maybe should look a lot more like the kind of earliest visions of what the internet was going to be. Like if you go back and read the kind of like early internet pioneers, everybody really understood the internet to be a fundamentally distributed system that was user owned, where an individual had a great deal of autonomy and sovereignty over software in the form of a personal computer, and anything that was on that personal computer really was yours and yours to design and manipulate however you wanted to. And we've really like moved away from that early vision. And I think there's a few different reasons why we moved away. Part of it is that we have some operating system, kind of lock in with major providers, like Apple, et cetera. Part of it is proprietary software that we now pay for, and therefore then have like limited autonomy to manipulate and customize. I think part of it is like the migration to the cloud, where like our data is not stored locally anymore. So we have a little bit less control over where it resides. And as well as things like, the kind of accumulation and centralization of market power in the form of data, which really was driven by base revenue models. So we just like have totally moved away from that early vision. And yet that early vision in many ways was quite resilient and democratic. And I think part of what excites me is I feel like we're now seeing a kind of wave of founders and entrepreneurs, many of whom were inspired by that kind of early pioneering group of, computer scientists and architects of the internet, to build structures that kind of resemble that and can do it now because technology has advanced in such a way that we actually are able to execute on some of that, even in the context of a much more kind of data rich, sophisticated environment, right? That's a really long answer to your question, but I think that's ultimately, kind of like what the North Star is and what we're doing. For sure, I think a lot of it, comes back to how you can ultimately empower people who are living in a regime that ultimately is hostile, or where, their information is insecure and so forth. And I think that often is a good barometer for like, okay, is this agentic or not? Like, would it ultimately empower a human rights defender or activist or political dissident who is otherwise being monitored and surveilled to like do the work they want to do? If the answer is yes, it probably is agency producing.
Yeah. And that early vision of the internet that you're describing is sort of the thesis behind what people are trying to accomplish with Web3, right? So we can definitely see, a lot of like natural synergies between what you guys are trying to accomplish with the fund and then also with what people in Web3 more broadly are trying to accomplish. Blockchain is public by default. And so we have all of this data that's public. How do you think about marrying that concept with the concept of user control and consent?
One of the things that's tricky about privacy as a concept generally is there often feels like there's a trade-off, and I don't know that it's inherently always the case, but a trade-off generally between like privacy and accountability, and that greater transparency and greater visibility increases accountability, and greater privacy can mask that accountability. And whenever I talk about privacy enhancing tools and technologies, oftentimes people's first question is like, but what about illicit activity? How do you deal with that? And I think there's like some satisfying and unsatisfying answers there. I do think that there are, kind of ways you can thread the needle where you do have a certain amount of accountability, also privacy, etc. And I think a lot of those types of, threading the needle solutions are being, pioneered by people who are focused on crypto and Web3, right? Where you want to preserve some of the elements of transparency and accountability, but you also, not everybody wants every transaction of theirs to be broadcast publicly, right? And, I think there's some interesting innovations right now, including things like privacy pools, which is using like association sets and exclusion proofs and things like that in order to kind of pool honest transactions together so that users can more easily prove that their transactions came from a set of honest deposits and so forth, that are finding ways to kind of strike that balance. Or, I would say broadly, any work that's happening, on zero knowledge helps to kind of thread that needle too. So, I'm optimistic that there's ways that you can kind of like satisfy both values. And again, like I said before, I'm not a total privacy absolutist. I know there's lots of reasons that you do want to sometimes share information and data, especially for collaboration purposes. And the real question is like, how do you do that in a way that is like responsible and ethical?
So I would love to hear some examples of solutions that you found or projects that you guys have invested in that you think can be really promising to achieve the end state that we're after with agentic tech.
Yeah, again, we're investing like broadly across a bunch of different areas and asset classes and things like that. But for example, like we invest in a company that does deep fake detection, so that's very much in the AI and Gen AI space. And we see that as being part of having a healthy information ecosystem, is the ability to have a certain amount of accountability, in that space broadly. I think what's interesting about it is when I was first looking at deep fake detection and first looking at this company, there was very little understanding in the industry about use cases and like the possibilities of like where there could be a market for this. Like I had a lot of investors say like, other than journalists, like who's going to need deep fake detection? Like there's no use case for that, or there's no market. And sure enough, now, fast forward a couple of years, we're realizing how easy it is to generate pretty high fidelity, high quality deep fakes or deep faked audio, etc. And so really their work in many ways has become about all purpose anti-fraud, and that could be identity fraud, that could be, in public forums, etc. And it turns out that has a lot of use cases, right? So that's one that doesn't immediately jump out to people as like, oh, that's about individual privacy and agency. It's a little bit more about like information integrity and the ability to have some sort of control over the information you consume and some sort of, source of trust and source of truth, but we also think is very important for, kind of functioning society. So that's one that's kind of, that's in the AI space. We also invested in a company that's really focused on open banking and kind of fiat on off ramps with a focus on emerging market exchanges and stable coins, which I think in many ways really, really, sort of resonated with me given some of the kind of early context in which I learned about crypto. And so that's a very different part of the like agentic tech ecosystem. Always, I think our focus is on things like access and trust. That can be of information and that could be also, of money, right?
The information piece is like really interesting because I think that doesn't immediately come up for people when they think about user control and consent and privacy and things like that. But really like the information that we're being fed online all the time. Like I've spoken to some friends whose parents, are on a very small corner of the internet, like a very small sliver of the internet. And they keep getting fed the same types of content over and over and over again. And it's almost like if your friend sends you a Fox News article and your algorithm gets on that track, and then it just kind of like circulates and you never get out of that. And that's just what you think is going on in the world. And that's like the only perspective you have. And it's really, it's really dangerous.
Super dangerous for the functioning of a free and open society. Yeah,
exactly.
Completely. I think what I worry about, we're in the US, we're in an election season. I think there may be plenty of, deepfake content of candidates come out, and there'll probably be some drama, some identification that it's fake and all of that. And I worry about that. But actually what I kind of worry about more is that on election day, you, Diana, get a voicemail from a friend of yours who's like, oh, yeah, it turns out that our polling location had a building, like a plumbing leak. And so they're actually going to close early, but they will be open tomorrow morning. And so you can go vote tomorrow. So yeah, Diana, I wouldn't go to the polls today. Like, it's a total mess. You should go tomorrow. And you're like, okay, like maybe I won't, I'm not going to vote today because like polling location's closing because of a plumbing issue. And you don't vote. And it turns out like that was fake, right? And so like those are the scenarios that I actually worry about more, because I think we're like really unprepared to be suspicious of that type of manipulation, the kind of manipulation of public figures, etc. Yeah, I think it still has the possibility for having a lot of bad consequences and impact. But I think we're a little bit more savvy that, oh, maybe that video of Biden isn't real, right? Or whatever. It's that latter piece that actually like makes me a little more anxious.
I never even thought of that as a potential use case for deepfakes. But yeah, that is terrifying. And I think another piece is like what you said about catching you off guard, like catching you by surprise. I think that's the most dangerous element. And on that vein, I almost think that it's more dangerous the way that the US operates with misinformation than somewhere like China. All your content and all your information is being censored. Like straight up, like Instagram is blocked,
right,
YouTube is blocked.
I guess
like
true.
You know what you're getting yourself into, right? Like you can consume news and media if you want in China, but like that like that's not really how it is. In the US, we're all about freedom of information, free speech, all of this stuff. Like this is what the assumption that people operate under. And so then when you're getting fed only a very small sliver of information from a very narrow perspective, and you expect that to be free speech, and this is like, well, nothing here is censored. Like we don't have censorship. So this is like everything that's happening. This is facts because like this is information I'm getting fed. Like I think that's where it becomes almost more dangerous than people in China or, North Korea, who, you know what you're getting yourself into.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think what's challenging is, yes, maybe if you're in China or North Korea, you kind of know things are coming through a filter bubble. The extent to which people are like fully aware of the scale, maybe hard to know. But there's also plenty of other places, like early in the Ukraine war, there was some research done on TikTok that showed that Russian users of TikTok were only able to see content for some period of time. And I don't know if it's still true today, from other accounts in Russia. So they were no longer able to get any news, information, posts, videos from outside, only from within their own information bubble. And so, does that have an impact on ordinary Russians' view of like what's happening on the border? Like, I'm sure it absolutely does, right? And yet at the time, were they totally aware that was what was being filtered and censored? I'm not sure. I would kind of doubt that people were fully aware. And so, I think there's like little versions of that can play out in lots of different places, including the US, and maybe in more subtle ways. Maybe it's like, it's not that your whole feed is being censored, but that, you're in the run up to election, like suddenly we're getting a lot more extremist content or conspiracy theories. And like, it's hard. It's like very hard to know. So that is part of what's scary. I mean, to bring it back a little bit to crypto, there actually are a bunch of folks who've been working on different approaches to content authenticity and content provenance around like using blockchain technology generally, or using smart contracts. And I find all that to be super interesting and fascinating. I think my big question mark is like, is it useful if you can't, even if you can't get kind of critical adoption, like critical mass adoption of it? Is it still useful to have some sort of like watermark that is attached to a smart contract for the purposes of authenticating certain types of media. And I remain open-minded about that, but I think we kind of have yet to see ultimately what will the standards be and so forth. There's an organization called the Content Authenticity Initiative that Adobe started that has their own framework called the C2PA, and that seems to be getting traction in certain ways. But there are a lot of people who've been thinking about ways you can put content on chain in order to have that provenance chain.
Interesting. What is, I guess, last question for you. What is that ideal end state that you hope we achieve? What I say ideal, but I mean also like realistic, that like you think we could actually achieve.
Yeah, I think that the ideal end state is that you live in a digital world in which like you actually and meaningfully have complete autonomy over your data and your digital footprint, and you have the ability to share that and revoke it with whoever you want in a pretty simple way, and the ability to have that be interoperable where you can like move it. If Apple is no longer serving you, like, can you take all of your data and move it to somebody else? Or if Google is not, whatever. And right now, like, that is essentially impossible to do. I mean, even like the CCPA requires that, websites have to allow you to like be able to extract certain parts of your data profile, but your ability to then port that over to some other service is like very, very hard, right? I think that kind of is an end state that would get us, a good way down the road to just like having more freedom and having more of an ability to really like opt in and opt out when you actually want to, in such a way that I think would make the whole digital environment healthier. Now, yes, there's also lots of other things I want to see. I want to see there be no more censorship. I want to see like free and open access to the internet so that people, don't necessarily have to use really sophisticated VPNs in order to like access basic information around the world. I want to see the ability of people to be able to communicate in secure, confidential ways, because I think that's kind of also critical to the human experience, right? So there's a lot of pieces of this, but I think like to me, that's the kind of like, that's the North Star.
What's your timeline for how long does it take us to get there?
Well, the exciting thing is that things like move really quickly in the tech ecosystem. And I think sometimes people are like, oh, it's too late, or like there's no way or whatever. But it's actually, I think, especially with this like current, wave of innovation in AI, like I think a lot of these questions are not answered yet about how ultimately, AI assistants or AI agents or sort of code and algorithms generally are going to interact with user data. I think there's a lot of opportunity to kind of change course. So I can't give you exact, years or anything, but I think it's fair to say like this doesn't necessarily require undoing everything. And it's I think to me, it requires building new tools and new architectures so that the way that we head over time is ultimately more favorable to end users.
Yeah, I like the optimism, and hopefully it comes sooner than later, hopefully in our lifetime soon, before more of my data gets taken by, sites like Temu because I'm silly and give my information away for free for no reason. So my last question that I ask every guest on this season of the podcast is, do you have a can you not for me about something that we talked about today or about like the space in general?
Along the lines of what we were just talking about, I think my can you not, or it's really like a can we not. I'm like, can we not act like it's all lost cause? Like all the time I talk to people who are like, it's too late, Instagram knows everything about me. It's too late, and about privacy, data privacy, but also about ethics too. People are like, it's too late. AI is already gonna, taking over the world. There's nothing we can do. It's too late, right? And I just like refuse to believe that. I'm like, no, we're still in the early innings of so much work and innovation and just like meaningful invention, right? And so it's like it is never too late, but also it is up to us to decide whether or not like they're like it really sort of undermines your own sense of autonomy to sort of say it's a lost cause. Yeah, and agency. Yeah, totally. So I think that's like, can we not do that? Can we act like there's actually some stuff we can do, and also acknowledging like what has been perhaps like not done well in the past?
Yeah, I love that. What a positive note to end on. We should never lose hope, right? Because like, what does that do for us? Think that everything is a lost cause and this is the end state that we're stuck in. It does nothing positive for us as users of the internet. So can we not act like everything is a lost cause, because everything is not. Zoe, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you personally, and also where people can go to check out ante and see your portfolio companies and check all of them out.
You can learn more about Ex-Ante at our website, which is buildexante.com. Ex-Ante is spelled Exante. It's a Latin phrase which means before the event, as opposed to ex post, after the fact. You don't want to be ex post. So that's where you can learn more about Ex-Ante, and you can follow me on X at Zoe Weinberg. We also have a Substack where we post things occasionally and so forth. So, and our whole portfolio also is on our website. So that's also where people can get a better sense of what is contained within the broader domain of agentic tech.
Amazing. We'll include all those links in the show notes as well to make it easy for people to click through. Thank you so much, Zoe, for taking the time to come on the podcast. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks to our live stream participants for being live in the chat. And we will be back again next week with another episode of Rehash. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Diana Chen. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at RehashWeb3 or on Warpcast and Lens at Rehash, and join our community on Telegram at t.me/rehashweb3. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.